Hello, my name is Greg J. Smith. I'm a Canadian writer and cultural worker with Holo. And today I'm joined by artist, educator, and editor, Mindy Seu, who I will introduce shortly. This is the fifth episode of the 2024 edition of Alt History, an online speaker series we began last year. And with this speaker series, we've turned to focus on the bleeding edge of art and technology to help us understand lost and forgotten moments in digital culture. So when I say alt history, for those of you not enough to catch the Usenet reference, what do I mean? I mean, new technologies or cultural developments are often synonymous with erasure. We forget how or why we used to do things, or even that we did do them, and what words or communities meant. Addressing these moments, practices, and labor that have faded from memory or perhaps been intentionally erased over the last 3 decades. Our goal is not simply to wax nostalgic about the past, but critically engage this erasure or, missingness or forgetting and use it to make sense of the present. This series is brought to you by Generation, a Braga, Portugal-based space for creation, performance, and exhibition with the domain of contemporary music and the relationship between art and technology. And my team at Holo. We're an editorial and curatorial platform founded in 2012. We're focused on what we call emerging trajectories in art, science, technology, and culture. And these interests manifest themselves in a few ways. In periodicals, always have this copy handy. We've published a few beefy, deep digital art anthologies over the last decade. Online at holo.mg, we have a kind of an evolving timeline of interdisciplinary practice, exhibitions, events, happenings, discoveries. And then finally, through collaborations with cultural partners, exactly what you are watching now. So thanks again to Generation for the invitation to host this series. It's been a really fun 10 conversations over the last 2 years, and I've just really enjoyed the entire experience. So finally, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Mindy Seu, who will be previewing her latest lecture performance, giving us a little taste test of a sexual history of the internet. Mindy is a designer and technologist based in New York City and Los Angeles. She's currently teaching as an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of Design, Media Arts. And then she's also the author, quite notably, of the Cyberfeminism Index, which we might talk about a little bit later today. And I thought this was fun. I noticed a kind of fun alt bio on her website. She also qualifies her last year as having given 89 lectures about internet history in 18 countries, taught 49 design students and 12 art students at 3 universities, and watched 8 sports documentaries, which we will probably not hear much about today. So with all of that said, Mindy, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm happy to be here. So, as mentioned, instead of giving a more classical lecture, I wanted to give a preview of a lecture performance that I've been beta testing right now called A Sexual History of the Internet. So I'm going to give you a bit of background first to set the stage, and then I'll give you a preview, and then Greg and I can talk about it. So imagine you are in some sort of cultural institution. Later this week, I'm actually going to be doing at Charles Street Video in Toronto as a beta test. I really like prototyping in public. So you're in this room with a bunch of other people. Instead of amphitheater seating, all the seats are facing random directions. It's pitch black, and instead of looking at me at a podium with the projector, you would instead be looking at your phone, and I would be a roving voice box reading things aloud to you. So in a second, I'm going to open up my phone. I just wanted to qualify that in the lecture, it's also a bit participatory. So when you see colored slides, those are actually meant to be read aloud by people in the audience. In this case, I'm not going to read them aloud, so you can read them on the screen. But you can also test this out because it's at a live link. So I'm going to open that up right now. And bear with me as I have seasonal allergies. Okay, so I'm going to share to my iPhone. All right. So you are now looking at one of my Finstas, sextech_v2. I've actually parked sextech v1 to v7, I believe. Because as we're testing these things out in public, I'm able to tweak them each time. I'm actually going to start with chapter 3. I'll read chapter 3 and 4, and then Greg and I can talk about it. Later on, if you want to see an updated version, you can check out Sex Tech subsequent versions or go back to this for any links or citations or things of this nature. Or I really hope to see you at a future event, hopefully when we start touring next spring. All right, let me take a sip of water and then maybe dab my nose and then we can start. All right, Chapter 3. Chapter 3, the internet was built on sex. When we hear about sex on the internet, it often involves jokes and theft. The first node in ARPANET was a Sigma 7 computer that ran the SEX operating system, shorthand for SETX. The first ASCII nude was a prank. In 1966, Ken Knowlton and Leon Harmon hung a 12-foot-long computer-generated mosaic of a nude woman on the wall of their boss's office as a joke. Later, Robert Rauschenberg displayed it during a Bell Labs event. From there, it ended up printed in the New York Times on October 11, 1967, for a story about avant-garde art and technology. Some of the first pornography on the internet was drawn with ASCII. Prior to ASCII, text-based erotica was first likely sent through teletext, a pre-internet technology from the 1970s for sending text to televisions. In 1972, Lena Forson was the centerfold of Playboy's November issue. It was her first and last nude image. Alexander Sachuk and his team at USC's Signal and Image Processing Institute used her image to test their latest compression algorithm. It became the industry standard, reanalyzed billions of times. This stolen image developed what we now know as the JPEG. For Chang, the moment that Lena's centerfold was torn and scanned marked tech's original sin. Many journals and institutions now outright ban submissions that feature Lena. Chapter 4, the internet was built by sex workers. So why isn't this part of techno-history? While its importance is evident in primary sources and oral histories, it's otherwise hard to prove. Livia Folds and Gabriela Garcia co-founded Decoding Stigma, a cross-institutional coalition that wants to compel conversations about sex and sex work at the tech school. Livia Folds also created the website Sex Workers Built the Internet, which gathers urgent scholarship that revises our history of the internet. It grew out of the 2021 educational series, Trains, Texts, and Tits. The series was organized by Hacking Hustling, a collective of sex workers, survivors, and accomplices that interrupts violence, facilitated by technology. With the emergence of personal computing in the 90s, some sex workers moved.
There were early Usenet conversations about sex work and in sex work specific Usenet groups. Alt-sex prostitution was probably the biggest one of those. And then later we get into this era of personal websites. Porn performers are certainly at the vanguard of that.
One of the first sex work websites was by Carol Leigh. Carol Leigh also coined the term sex work. Social sites like StripperWeb, Hornet, and My Red Book act as digital black books for sex workers to offer tips of the trade and safety tools.
As sex workers, we understood intuitively from the beginning of social media, maybe even from the beginning of the internet, that the reason to be online is to sell something.
As bandwidth gets better, we see the rise of camming and liveness.
More models moved online, the webmaster industry began to boom, offering porn performers with a high earning potential, the ability to have someone not only custom build a website, but also update and manage it as well. And also cover the cost of the really outlandish website hosting fees, and then cutting the model a check by paying, by taking a percentage of the fees. So when I think about that, I think about sites like OnlyFans and all of these other current existing platforms that we use. This idea of another company taking on these fees is nothing, and charging the model for the fees is nothing new. It's something that we've been experiencing since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the internet.
In 1996, the Communications and Decency Act stated that internet platforms were not liable for what is posted on their platform. This was overhauled with FOSTA SESTA in 2018. Intended to halt child sex trafficking, it also endangered sex workers by eradicating the online infrastructure of their labor. With ongoing rug pulling, sex workers continue to innovate and test alternate channels, expanding their pussy capital. And that's chapter 5, which we're not gonna do now. I also want to just give a quick teaser of what this looks like in space with hundreds of people. This one was at Heart Gallery in Manhattan, which is a new space run by Maya Mann. Let's turn on this. I'm going to play that again. So even though we all try to start at the same time, because there's always an inherent lag, you get this twinkling light effect. And as people are assigned different colors to read, it almost starts to feel very choral. And it's interesting forcing or encouraging people to read people aloud that they either hadn't known before, to champion the voices of very marginalized people and communities, and to do a bit of gender and queer swapping as well. So I think with that, maybe I'll stop screen sharing and we can chat. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. That was super, super interesting, and I have a million things I want to ask you. I kind of came with some ideas in mind, but I've jotted down some notes or stuff I'll circle back to. I guess the easiest place to start, many folks will know you from the Cyberfeminism Index project. And there, you intervened in a particular corner of net art and created kind of a corrective to help give queer and POC women and women identifying artists visibility in a maybe under or misunderstood or recognized or under-recognized canon. So here the intervention seems to be bringing maybe, and I'm speaking more broadly about the project, not just the chapters that you shared, but a sensuality or different embodiment to the history of the internet. Could you talk a little about what your goals for the project are? And I'm curious about and I really enjoyed the chorus voice clips. I'm excited to experience this myself soon. I'm curious to hear about your motivations and impact you kind of desire for viewers and participants in this performance, which is very much not just you talking at the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I think that to answer that first question, it really does feel like a natural bridge from the Cyberfeminism Index. The Cyberfeminism Index, when VNS Matrix coined the term cyberfeminism in 1991, they were really trying to inject this idea of a cold, sterile, metallic, militaristic internet with the slimy viscera of the body, right? Like understanding that the internet is really rooted in nature and that we are bringing embodied experiences into the web. So this might be a more specific lens into that. Trying to understand how sex has always been part of the internet, maybe in a very underground way, and maybe not even at the helm of sex workers, except in very certain avenues. But certainly everyone who uses the internet now is grappling with something sexually related in some way. So the reason why we wanted to use Instagram, when I say we, it's because I'm constantly talking to a lot of different friends and collaborators. The primary one here was Julio Correa, who created this format. We were really thinking that Instagram is absolutely a sex app. Most apps are. So when you think about the content on Instagram, when you think about the DMing quality, all sorts of other details, it really shows how these tools are really encouraged to promote consumption, promote the gaze, and perhaps not really focusing on the creators themselves, but rather the extractive qualities from them. So this was kind of a way to force or encourage the people in the audience to rethink how we use Instagram. When I'm using stories, I click through half a second per thing. It's very, very quick. But if you actually let the UX play out, a standard static slide lasts for 5 seconds automatically, and a video slide lasts for up to a minute. So if you just let that run, you feel kind of itchy because you want to view it quickly, but instead you kind of like fall into this meditative state because the pacing is out of your control. And again, that choral quality happens. Usually Instagram was a very insular thing. So just trying to be cognizant of this behavioral shift.
So it's as much about the medium as it is about the content.
Always.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I wouldn't have, I mean, of course, the thing on Instagram is going to have an embedded critique on Instagram. I wonder if you could just think about this a little more. I personally don't have a personal Instagram account, but I know how consumptive it is. Could you talk expand a little bit on this idea of it as a sex app? Because I think that's provocative. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there's this great article about teledildonics by Bonia Coronor. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing their name. In which they talk about how our body is spread across multiple apps and devices, and we're trying to kind of piece them together. So I send voice notes to friends, TSA now has scans of my eyes. The health app scans my heartbeat and the number of steps I take. Of course, there's photos of my face and all my limbs and bodies all over Instagram or other apps. And we're trying to figure out what the sensuality of these things mean. Is there actually, first of all, what is sex? Can you have sex if it's not physical? Is sexting similar to sex? What are the power dynamics embedded in these things? I feel like these are all things that we're trying to question. And the reason we use Instagram specifically is because, one, it's a publishing device with the stories and etc. And two, it's also very ubiquitous. So by forcing these behavioral shifts, when people later share stories from this lecture to their personal accounts at the end of the performance, they're also kind of infiltrating this type of underserved historical content into a space that isn't meant to be very educational.
Yeah.
So really trying to subvert the intended functions of these apps.
Okay, one more question, because I'm just fascinated by this. I mean, I always am talking to 20-year-olds, like perpetually. I'm just every year I get older, but I keep teaching 20-year-olds. And I've
Same.
heard the thinking around body dysmorphia and, like, I don't know, self self-worth and comparison. Like, this is just constant source of vexation, straight, queer, male, female, cisgender, otherwise.
Yes.
I'm just like, because it's interesting, because like people, like, it seems like I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, just that like people are like very much like looking at the image and being troubled by it, and playing the comparison game that we see so much across social media. I'm just, because what you just described, it's completely true. And to hear you talk about this, like, I'm discombobulated, my eyes are in the TSA database, and there's pictures of individual limbs, my body is all over the place. Nobody has any understanding of this relation to embodiment, though, despite the fact that they're just kind of like very literally thinking about the content in pictures and then using that to evaluate themselves. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? Like, is this something I guess it's something you're trying to trouble and make other people kind of latch onto?
Well, I think that's kind of the point. Like,
Yeah.
if we were to use Instagram in the way that it was intended,
Yeah.
which in most cases I actually really do. I'm like a very
Mhm.
active online user. I don't use Twitter or TikTok, but I'm very on Instagram.
Yeah.
If we were to just use it the way they want, it's about shares, it's
Yeah.
about likes, it's about affirmation. So it's not a very discursive platform, right? Typically people like add an emoji as a comment or something like this.
Mhm.
It also means that the things that do really well algorithmically are things that are meant to be viral, that things that appear perfect or feel very salacious or something like this, right? Very much not real. But if you actually try to examine this, whether through a behavioral shift or by examining what kind of content you're actually trying to push online, and for which people, is it actually meant for hundreds of millions of people or not, then we can actually try to reframe how we can use this tool for ourselves instead of just using it in the intended way. I think this is kind of the subversion that I'm looking at. You can absolutely continue to use it in a way that, I mean, I feel it's so hard for like Gen Z people now. You grow up online,
Yeah.
you maybe learn to trouble the usage of it after years and years and years of it wearing you down
Yeah.
until you reach some sort of breaking point. But I wonder if there's a way to encourage that examination earlier. I don't know if this is exactly the way, but it's certainly a way to think about it a bit differently.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, back to teledildonics, a sentence I don't get to say enough in my life. So personal computing has always had a body problem. And then I'm just riffing off another chapter that you didn't share today, but you did bring up teledildonics. So if we think
Yeah.
about the senses it engages through touch, they're pretty limited and crude. The mouse is crude. I got one here. Its design hasn't changed much in a half century. And while it's more sensual than the mouse, what Brett Victor calls fingers on glass paradigm of smartphones is still very tempered, and like, sure, the thing responds to touch, but it's still like very, I don't know, one-dimensional. So where do you, because it seems like you're using I can't talk, teledildonics as kind of a critical intervention here. So where would you position this in the history of UX and interaction design, these devices?
Wow. So a different chapter
Yeah.
is called The Computer Mouse's Vulva, and it talks about, amongst other people, the research of Ali Na. And Ali Na really tries to situate the history of the computer mouse within this longer, like, military industrial complex. So she talks about the light pen, which was initially used as a training device by the military and then very much adopted into arcades. But the tool itself is actually quite phallic, so the function of it will definitely change your behavior compared to a mouse. So of course, then we have Douglas Engelbart, who introduces and creates the computer mouse with the mother of all demos. And as this shape begins to evolve, Ali Na basically equates the shape of the computer mouse, the famous two-pronged one with like the roller ball in the center, as a vulva, the computer mouse as vulva. She then also talks about how this can easily shift into the trackpads and things that we use now because they are very pressure sensitive, they're haptic, it includes pressure sensitivity and vibration and things like this. And then we can question all the things that might come after that, like our iPhones or things that we're just using with our voice without actually needing to touch, and etc. So what I like about the computer mouse as vulva is it tries to figure out how our behaviors shift depending on the design, and also what it means to have a yonic technology rather than the phallic one. She points out this great thing where if you consider it as a vulva, because the cord or how it attaches to the computer, the only thing beyond that is actually the arm. So there's actually no like vaginal canal. There's no possibility for penetration. The function then also feels quite different because the way you move the mouse, you're kind of cradling it, and you're not, the axis of which you're trying to interact with things on screen is not actually directive. You're pointing down versus the pen, which is pointing forward. So I think all of these things are actually quite fascinating to include. And then the teledildonic part, that was coined initially by Ted Nelson, the father of the concept of hyperlinks and hypertext, hypermedia. Tela was then added by Howard Rheingold. And here, this is really just thinking like how you can have intimacy in online spaces with two people that are very far apart. Of course, maybe at that time they were focusing very much on hardware. What are the devices that might replace a human body or a human appendage if your lover is not close? But there's also ways to extrapolate upon this where it's actually very conceptual. Like, what does sex and intimacy actually mean? What are ways of touching someone from afar? What are ways of creating an imagination of sex that doesn't actually require any hardware? I think these are actually quite important ways to just examine this very heteronormative framework of sexuality that we're taught in schools or taught through porn or things of this nature.
Okay, thank you. And that kind of leads me to a next point, which again is kind of referring to some of the other chapters that you have in the works. But I think this is important because you just kind of talked about Douglas Engelbart and the mother of all demos, and Ted Nelson is the father of hypertext. So it seems that other chapter and some of the language here, there's some kind of air quotes around some of those things you said, you push back against like patriarchal flag planting, whereby male figures invent or name computing paradigms. And then also you contrast that with women's physiology in ways that shape future discourse. So you catalog accomplishments and misdeeds by the fathers of personal computing alongside the intensely problematic fathers of gynecological science. Can you talk a little about the connections we might draw between these two patriarchal genealogies?
Yeah, I actually was thinking about this recently. It seems like the fathers is what you're describing as flag planting, right?
Yeah.
They discovered something, they're going to name it after themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas when we think about things that use female names, it's often like tools, like this demo by Douglas Engelbart. Things that you use, like cars and boats, are often named after women. Assistants like Siri, Alexa, Cortana are named after women. So the functions are very different. What gets a male gendered name and what gets a female gendered name. What you're referring to about the physiology, though, is from the interlude of this, where I basically go through and talk about all the different body parts noted by Annie Liu, an amazing artist, around women's gynecology that are named after men. So, like the G spot, for example, is actually named after Ernst Grafenberg G. And this goes through like maybe 20 different body parts. The most notable one, though, is by J. Marion Sims. J. Marion Sims is considered the father of modern gynecology, and he discovered the Skene's gland, which is the glands that becomes engorged and allows a woman to squirt during orgasm. So this was actually discovered by doing unconsenting gynecological exams on women, enslaved women, without anesthesia. And 3 of those women were named Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. So there's a lot of like wetware collectives like Gynpunk from Latin America that really tried to talk about this extremely perverse medical history and also rallied to rename these body parts. Gynpunk, or Cloud Kinky, one of the members, encourages us to now call it Anarcha's gland rather than the Skene's gland. So I think this might be maybe the smallest gesture of repair. It's also quite perverse that maybe at this point, as of 2020, 85% of women, of gynecologists in the US are women, but Sims is still considered the father of modern gynecology. So I think all of these things definitely need some sort of asterisk or correction.
Yeah, so file that maybe next to our Confederate war hero statues and getting
Exactly.
toppled or collectively removed, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Okay,
It's not
thank
about
you.
erasure, but definitely
Yeah,
correction.
yeah, correction, or like, is this the person we want to be giving naming rights to something for in
Yes.
perpetuity or whatever? Cool. And I wasn't, did you call it, what's that collective in Latin America you name checked? I'm sorry.
Gynpunk.
Geinpunk. I will
Yeah.
be looking them up later. Okay, and some more thoughts. It seems a lot here, and this is a loaded question, but it seems like a lot of this project is looking back to the 70s through 90s, the early days of the public internet and personal computing. How do you, and again, this is a huge question, so bear with me because I know you can only answer in so much detail, but how do you think the subsequent moments of Web 2.0 and platform capitalism have captured and molded sexuality? You mentioned Instagram as a sex app, but what other big arcs or developments might be kind of put post, I don't know, .com crash or something like that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the examples that I shared today maybe are from that era, but there are
Yeah.
certainly things in later chapters that feel more contemporary,
Yeah.
such as like cryptocurrencies and things like
Yep.
this. So I think that in at least the chapters that I shared, it
Yeah.
highlights some very, very early websites from Web 2.0 where people were using these platforms as a form of like resource sharing. So these were specifically online communities for sex workers to share tips of the trade. This then segues into Fosta Sesta. During this time, we move away from bespoke handmade websites into this idea of platforms. This is really happening in like the 2000s. So platforms get tricky because now platforms are scared that they're going to get in trouble for what's used, even if everyone's now using templates and not many people know how to code or push a website online. This is where a lot of erasure starts happening. So you basically are able to push people off platform or prevent them from selling things on their platform. Or if they are selling things, they have to use a different payment processor or get a huge cut removed or things like this. So that's one component. Another component is we suddenly have a lot of these, like, some people attribute this to like sex workers proper, some people attribute this to big porn, but you then have like all of these mechanisms that are created, like trying to increase bandwidth so you have better video streaming, trying to be able to talk with content creators, one of the first examples of virality on early internet is for e-com was like Pam Anderson's sex tape. So all of these things, is it about people just really, really, really wanting to do things that are sex related and consume that? Or are we trying to give credit to the actual pornographers and people, whether it's stolen porn or actually pornographers, giving them credit in some form? This gets really muddy, and there's actually a lot of oral histories about this, but not actually many things that are textual documents or recorded documents that can be cited. That's why this history gets really complicated. Scholars like Ezra Paget, who studies the semiotics of sex and transaction, she argues that some of the first people to create a shippable, usable product on Web3, a cryptocurrency called Spank Chain, were actually developed by sex workers like Ali Eve Knox. Yeah. And around this time, of course, there was a lot of things happening around Web3, but they were all quite speculative and got a fair amount of funding, whereas this one was actually a usable product. Yeah. So again, who are we attributing this growth potential of this new space to? Of course, speculation is important, but if people are actually using this thing because MasterCard keeps declining their payments, so they're actually using these things as a form of innovation, then I think that should be part of the record in some way.
Yeah.
So it points to a lot of examples like this.
So this is your like sex workers built the internet refrain is actually like it's because they've been criminalized and pushed away so many times that they've had to innovate. Like,
well, I don't even know if it's like what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
Are they doing these things because they're marginalized, or are they inherently innovative and they're like pushing forward new technologies? I like to think of the latter. Yeah. But that phrase, workers built the internet, was actually coined by Livia Folds, who has done a lot of research around this topic.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I know it's a lot to.
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, it's like I'm doing a hypertext in my head right now. I'm like, which decade, which ethical question, which platform? Well, here's something you mentioned. You mentioned OnlyFans, which I think is interesting, and I kind of from the outside understand what's novel about it is it's allowed creators to, whatever that means, however sex focused or PG-13 that is, to control their monetization directly and engage with fans one-to-one in a not completely exploitive way. Like what do you think about that platform? Where does that fit into your history? Would that be like kind of like what current things exactly? I know you talk about AI girlfriends and stuff, and you mentioned personal companions earlier, so maybe we talk about them, but like what are the things that are happening right now that are kind of on your radar for incorporation in future chapters?
I have a lot of mixed thoughts about OnlyFans.
Yeah.
I think in some way it did give like models and content creators a bit more autonomy.
Yeah.
I think the trouble is everyone, when you say OnlyFans, your mind goes to one thing. It has a very clear connotation. Yet, so clearly those people helped build up the reputation and function of that platform.
Yeah.
Yet when you look at it now that it's a household name, they're really trying to focus on, this is a subscription-based content creation platform.
Yeah.
It's not actually a sex platform. So the things that they highlight are like their cooking channels or other instructional videos. So once again, it's like you use sex workers to build up the function and use and audience of a platform, and then quietly push them to the side so you can amplify this other thing that might be considered more palatable.
Yeah.
And that also goes beyond reputation or connotation. This also flows into the infrastructure of the platform. So because of various content or payment processing trickiness with these credit card companies and credit card processors, when you're on the platform, you basically have to toggle whether you're doing adult content or not. So if you were a creator that actually does both, you have a cooking channel and you also send images to clients, you automatically default to adult, which means that you're using a different payment processor, you have a higher cut taken away, and you also have a delay in when your payment is received compared to if you were only doing non-adult content creation. And this is actually really frustrating for models because on the one hand, once again, you have this huge platform that you feel like you need to use because you will get more visibility. But on the other hand, it's kind of like the better of two evils because there's a lot of these things that the platform is not doing to amplify or champion their models.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's all so complicated. I think people certainly get more visibility than if they were doing this on their own channels. It helps amplify smaller people too. But there's also a lot of other channels and platforms that are created by sex workers that are trying to kind of do this in their own way. It's just harder to maintain because lack of resources, lack of funding, startup life is difficult, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
Could you point at any perchance?
I'm forgetting the name of
Yeah.
the primary competitor. It's like Sunflower or something like
Okay.
this.
But it's like a more scrappy, better
It's
politics version.
yes, it was
Yeah.
created by two women. If I combed through my email really quickly, I could find it. But it's basically a
Yeah.
startup that functions the exact same way as OnlyFans,
Yeah.
except that it's much more fair to its models. But even
Yeah.
now, in this recollection, the fact that I can't immediately recall them talks
Right.
about how small they are,
Yeah.
or like you kind of want to amplify them, but it's like a very David and Goliath type balance.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay. So the other half of that question was like, what other things that are going on right now track and do you imagine being, because I know this is a work in process, so I'm assuming it'll grow. What other kind of contemporary phenomena, you mentioned AI girlfriends, AI
Yes.
personas or whatever, like what other things do you imagine bubbling up in this research and being addressed? Or maybe also that already are and we didn't get to see today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because, like, as we have these big peaks of new
Yeah.
technologies,
Yeah.
like everyone's talking about NFTs in 2020, and then everyone's
Yeah.
talking about AI in 2024, and
Yep.
etc. Um, all of these things compared with some larger sexual content push, whether that's Replica creating an AI girlfriend, and it's really helped strengthen these AI chatbots, or other people who are creating like AI generated images. An actually really interesting art project, speculative project, is by Sarah Friend, that I'm
Yes.
actually putting on the revised version. She has a great project called Prompt Baby,
Yeah.
which is really thinking about what consent and collaboration could look like with a client. So currently, we're all very familiar with the proliferation of deepfakes. For people who have a lot of images of themselves online, or not, if you actually want to upload a photo of your face or someone else's face to one of these like revenge porn generators, Hannah Bayer actually tested this out for a recent article in Art Forum. She uploaded a photo of herself into this generator. It fed her back a very blurry nude of herself, but she couldn't actually access the nude because it was behind a paywall. So this was so unfortunate in so many different levels. She doesn't have access to her own image. She doesn't have access. Um, this was obviously very dangerous for people who are using this as a revenge porn or something quite manipulative. So within that world, Sarah created this project called Prompt Baby, where she trains an AI model on images of herself. She sold these NFTs. She sold 69. They sold out in 16 seconds. And if you purchase an NFT, you can ask, you get access to one prompt. So you tell Sarah a prompt of what you want this image of her to be, and she can decide to accept it, reject it, or modify the prompt. Once you agree on the edited prompt, she will run that image, and that's the image that you will receive. So you're basically generating nudes or whatever you want. There's no parameters of Sarah in collaboration with the artist and model. It's actually a really interesting way. If you're trying to consume content from another person, wouldn't you want to be in collaboration with them? Like, this is why chatbots on OnlyFans are so popular, because you want to develop what you think is a genuine relationship with that performer. So maybe this is another avenue of getting to that, rather than this idea that you're just going to generate images of people you don't know and have no relationship with.
Right. Yeah, kudos on you. I'm not at all surprised that that project is on your radar, but I think it's so smart. And I know how it's funny, as a man, like deep fakes are one thing, maybe titillating or a curiosity, but I know women have like an abject terror
Yes.
of them. Like it's actually like some little part of their brain is worried about, images being taken and stuff. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because you mentioned like some of the I think there were some moments in your performance where you talked about kind of the theft of either
Hmm.
sex workers' content or labor. Deepfakes is obviously like the theft of photographies and
Yes.
reappropriation of it. Um, well, I guess I don't want, it's too naive of a question to ask, like, why does this keep happening?
Well, I think
Maybe, yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Resource extraction
Yeah,
is what? A primary avenue of capital.
yeah,
So, if you're trying to get rich quick, you don't necessarily have to compensate anyone because
yeah,
you think that all of these things are meant to be extracted. Um, I mean, with the rise of modernism, there was like this very unfortunate binary between like moderns, man, and nature, which was everything else that could be an extracted resources to, yes, we kind of know the story. But it's not only sex workers imagery. It's not only about Lena Forsen. It's
yeah,
not only about Hannah Bayer. It's not only about all these other people. This is happening to all of us. This is why people like Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, they're working on that public fund because then you can have images that are part of a data set that you can still use as an LLM, but it's not actually going to be extracting resources uncompensated from every person that's used whatever application or software. I I don't know if that's true. I was going to say I deserve to use Instagram and not have my images scraped, but that's actually part of the fine print of Instagram,
yeah,
right? These are the trade-offs we have for having this free, very addictive platform.
yeah.
So I think it's kind of forcing us all to reckon with that, regardless if it's used in a sexually unethical way or not.
Yeah, just one quick note there. The Canadian artist Ben Bogart was
Mm.
recently um, interviewed by Natalie Bacon, who's a great Quebec curator, and Ben talked about this idea that essentially like it's really rich. All these artists are like concerned about the appropriation of their artwork when they've been posting to corporate social media for like 15 years. Like,
Yes,
like of
exactly.
course this is going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think about because the idea, I mean, artists so intrinsically think about their work as their property and they have rights to even if they are sharing it. But I guess if the internet has taught us anything over the last 4 or 5 years, it's like, no, like you really are grist for the mill.
Yeah.
Another question, do you have any like thoughts like on the ethics, aesthetics, I don't know, sensuality even of AI companions? Like what do you
Yeah.
see coming there that excites and or concerns you?
Well, I do think there are some platforms like Replica that I think are quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's also because like for the most part, compared to other AI companies, I trust the CEO and I feel like they're doing it with the specific intention. I do think at a certain scale, perhaps everyone is corruptible. So that's why I say this with a bit of pause.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that we have a huge loneliness epidemic. And I think, for example, this is not about AI girlfriends, but just AI tools. My mom, who is an absolute Luddite, for whatever reason, loves Bard. She uses Bard to draft emails to her clients because it's really learned her Korean English like mix of language and it helps her draft these emails. So obviously these tools can be used in a beneficial way. But I think that even if we have examples of these smaller use cases that are helpful, the wider implications of these things, again, are built on this idea of scalability at all costs, of
Hmm.
extraction of every single person who uses the platform, of the eradication of human labor. Unless we actually have companies that value not doing those things alongside building these tools for public good, then
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we're only creating tools that are meant to eradicate labor systems for the benefit of a small minority. This is what concerns me. Not to mention, art doesn't have a fiscal purpose. Like, if we actually are trying to generate artworks, it does beg the question of what is the point of creating beauty? Or is it the process behind it? I think it really makes us question this on an existential level that we should be examining a bit more, instead of just being able to push a button and losing all of that, those referential links, the process, the iteration. Yeah, the ease of all of this, I think a lot of people are discussing, but maybe should be discussed more within the corporations.
Yeah. And I know one of the problems, I mean, I for me personally, like one of the things I've really come to realize in the last while is like you talked about public goods platforms versus growth platforms. And I know you like work with like Arena, and they're an example of like a small company. I don't know if they have venture capital or not, but
They do
I know
not, yeah.
the problem with venture capital is always that people are looking for these outsized returns to
Mhm.
pay off all their other losing bets, and everything is
Yes.
always so growth focused. So this is something I always talk about with my students is like, could we imagine different platforms that weren't made with this growth imperative, and how would they treat us and how would they make us feel? And it's
Yes,
hard because there's so
absolutely.
few of them.
We
Yeah.
should encourage people to, okay, first normalize this idea that projects take a long time. This idea of churning out some big project every year for an artist is
Yeah.
crazy. It's too
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Not to mention, yes, slow growth is actually really important. Arena has been offered VC funding a number of times. It's always been turned down. The way their company grows is because people buy subscriptions. And we might say that the golden age of subscriptions has passed, but
Yeah.
still, there are so many Arena loyalists that they
Yeah.
continue to grow every year in a slow, sustainable model.
Yeah.
So just like, I don't know, I kind of think about it like the food movement too. You had farms, you had grocery stores, you had mega grocery stores, and that kind of like pushed this need for like farmers markets again. So
Yeah.
maybe we're gonna loop, but we're now in this like big grocery store platform oligopoly moment, and that will eventually push to this more bespoke artisanal side. I
Right.
do think that naturally happens.
Yeah, like I guess the dark forest theory of the internet, or these cozy
Sure,
web, like
exactly.
these places with different values and off the
Yes,
platform and not as visible.
yes.
Yeah. Oh, sign me up.
I'm
Um,
sure you're already part of them. I
I
feel like
mean,
on
kind
Discords
of.
or internal
Yeah,
channels and
Discords are nice. I mean, has its own
yeah,
grind. I'm in a number. It's like niche interests. They are nice. They
yeah.
feel manageable. I don't feel um like I'm being gamed. I find it, but it's still tiring. That's the problem. I mean, I mean, this is a little off topic, but I think it's interesting. Like post Twitter melting down, and now there being like eight other we got the Fediverse and Blue Sky and this and that. Like everybody's scattered and what,
Yes.
it's, I don't know. It's more liberating than the platform moment, but it's also more, I don't know, atomizing or something.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we'll start to wind down. I guess I know this project is in development, and I know that you work iteratively, so you probably don't have a prescribed master plan. But where do you see it heading, and what does next year look like when you're touring it? Like, what will the outputs be? Is the performance the end thing, or is there other outputs in the works? And maybe you don't want to share everything, but share what you can.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I will say nothing is booked yet. I think what's
Yeah,
interesting is like because I've been prototyping in public,
yeah,
which is what I did for Cyberfem too. It's not a strategy, it's just like the way I like to work because I really like feedback.
yeah,
And you also learn all these other references that are then cited and built into the thing. It feels very iterative. So hopefully that will tour next year. And then we're also going to, I think having a document off platform is very important just in terms of record making. So we're planning to publish a primer with Meta Label, which is the new platform for artist collectives and
yeah,
independent publishing. That will basically serve as basically an art book, not an essay anthology. That it everything that you saw today are basically lecture slides, which are
yeah,
essentially pages of a book or a story, a publication. So this it will be accompanied by something like that, but it won't
yeah,
be like Cyberfem. It'll be a much smaller run. Hopefully, we can take way more design liberties because it's an art book and it doesn't
yeah.
have to be as saleable. Um, and then I've always been a big planner, but these days I'm trying to really trust emergence. So I'm just going to throw these things out into the world and see how it naturally evolves.
Makes sense. Okay, Mindy Sue, thank you so much for
Thanks,
joining us
Greg.
today. Thank you for sharing this work in progress. It's special to see something when it's formative, so appreciate your sharing this work with us.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time and generosity today.
Appreciate all your thoughtful questions too, Greg. Thanks so much.